Hey guys, we're going to start looking at Chapter 12, Nervous System, and especially the nervous tissue. And the general functions of the nervous system will be collecting information, that would be receptors, and then sending that information into the brain or spinal cord. That would be sensory neurons, or what we call afferent neurons. The spinal cord or brain will process and evaluate the information and then determine what response needs to be made. This is then sent to the effector via an efferent or motor neuron, and effectors are muscles and glands. We have both central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord, and also peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is going to be the cranial and spinal nerves and also the ganglia. Here is a picture of the brain, and you can also see the spinal cord here. For the peripheral nervous system, there are nerves that exit out of the spinal cord and out of the brain. Functional organization of the nervous system involves both the sensory nervous system or afferent nervous system and the motor nervous system. The somatic sensory neurons carry information into the central nervous system from the eyes and the ears and the skin. The visceral sensory input will come from blood vessels and internal organs. Motor nervous system is output. That will either go through somatic motor neurons to skeletal muscles or through autonomic motor neurons to effectors that we don't consciously control, like our heart muscle, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. Here are some of the general characteristics of neurons. Excitability, we saw that with muscle already. Conductivity, meaning to propagate an electrical signal, we also saw that with muscle. So when we were going over the neuromuscular junction, the neuron produced a secretion of neurotransmitter, and then that influenced the target cell. Neurons have an extremely long lifetime. The cell can live throughout a person's lifetime, and they are amitotic. After fetal development, basically, these neurons are going to last your whole life, and then they don't divide. So here's a picture of a neuron. Remember, neurons have dendrites that carry the signal into the cell body, which has the nucleus, and then also axons that carry the information away from the cell body. There's also neuroglia or glial cells, which are the supporting and protective cells for neurons. This was the neuron we looked at in lab. With neuron transport, the axons are what move materials to and from the cell body. We call it anterograde transport when substances move from the cell body, where these substances are made, toward the synaptic knobs. Retrograde transport means substances are moving from the synaptic knobs toward the cell body or soma. Retrograde transport can be either by fast or slow axonal transport. If we're looking at fast axonal transport or fast transport in axons, this is going to be about 16 inches a day, very quick. It involves movement along microtubules within the cytoplasm and requires ATP. This can be either anterograde of vesicles or organelles going from the cell body toward the axon terminal, or retrograde. Sometimes there are substances that move from the axon terminal back to the cell body. Slow axonal transport is going to result from the flow of axoplasm or cytoplasm. It's a very slow transport, and this would be substances that are produced in the cell body moving toward the synaptic knob. Neurons can be classified structurally based on the number of processes that exit out of the cell body. So we looked at this in lab. If there are many dendrites and an axon, then you have more than two processes extending from the cell body. This is the most common type, and we call that a multipolar neuron. Bipolar neurons have two processes extending from the cell body. An example of this would be in the retina of the eye. Unipolar neurons have one process that extends from the cell body. An example of this would be sensory neurons. Here's a multipolar neuron, a bipolar neuron with two processes, 1, 2, extending from the cell body. And here's the cell body with only one process extending, and then that process branches. So that's called a unipolar neuron. Functional classification of neurons are sensory, motor, and also interneurons. Sensory input or sensory neurons carry information from receptors into the central nervous system. In this case, we see a sensory neuron. This is also a unipolar neuron, and here is the cell body. Interneurons are those that are completely within the central nervous system. They connect sensory neurons and motor neurons. Here's a motor neuron that conducts information out of the central nervous system to an effector, which can be a muscle or gland. In this case, this is a motor neuron because it's going to skeletal muscle. Here's the same model that we looked at in lab. You can see these three neurons, sensory, interneuron, and motor neuron going to a muscle. Cranial nerves are nerves that extend from the brain, and spinal nerves are nerves that extend from the spinal cord. Remember, nerves are bundles of axons in the peripheral nervous system. So here we see cranial nerves, and here we see spinal nerves. A synapse is a place where a neuron connects to another neuron or an effector. For instance, we saw a synapse with the neuromuscular junction. The neuromuscular junction was a synapse of a motor neuron axon with the motor end plate, part of the sarcolemma of a muscle fiber. So this was considered to be a synapse. And here is the synaptic cleft. An electrical synapse is going to be a synapse between two neurons where there are gap junctions between them. Remember the communicating junctions. Very quick with no synaptic delay because the cell membranes are actually attached to each other. If we're looking at a chemical synapse, we have two neurons, kind of like we had with the neuromuscular junction, where we have one neuron that is going to produce neurotransmitter onto another neuron. Here's another example of the same thing. So we have what we call a presynaptic neuron that produces the neurotransmitter and releases it onto either the cell body or dendrites of the postsynaptic membrane. The synapse, remember, is what's between the two. And that's the end of this portion. Please watch the next one. We're going to go over nerve impulse generation.